Hi students. So, time to talk about rondo form for week 5. We're going to do rondo form in this video and then sonata rondo in the second video of the week. So, let's start with a couple basics about rondo form. I will tell you first it is not, well, let me turn that off, not unlike compound ternary form, but with more sections. So you were used to seeing in compound ternary A, B, and A prime, perhaps. And you're used to those having nested forms within them, like the binary form within the ternary form, etc. And now in rondo form, we're going to continue adding on. So we could have a 5-part rondo, which would be A, B, A, C, A, or 7-part, which would be all of those parts plus a D section and an A section. So each of these we call A1, A2, A3. 7-part rondos are not terribly common, so I'm not going to show you an example of one. We'll focus on a 5-part rondo. And in each of these we could have transitions or retransitions, transitions, moving from A to an episode, which is what we call those B, C, and D sections, or retransition, which is moving from an episode back to A. So I've added a chart down here where we can track the movement that we're going to do first. We'll start with this second movement from Beethoven. I can leave that underlined, I guess. Beethoven Piano Sonata in C minor, Opus 13, and it is the second movement. You did the first movement when we talked about sonata form last week, so we're going to move through each of the 3 movements of the sonata, and I like doing that to have a complete kind of tour through a particular sonata. So even though this movement is in, even though the sonata total is in C minor and the title of it is in C minor, individual movements may not be. So here's a movement that is in A flat major. One more thing to note here is that A, B, C, and D, if applicable, if there is a D section, must end with a PAC in their respective keys. So that's how you can tell that B is over, for example, and that a retransition has begun, or that C is over, etc. So sometimes that can seem a little ambiguous. It may modulate quite a bit, but ultimately you can tell from the fact that there's a perfect authentic cadence in some key ending those sections. If you haven't already, go ahead and pause this video and go listen to it on YouTube. I've given you a link, or perhaps you have a recording of it yourself, but you'll want to listen to it before we start talking about it. And I'm going to assume now that you're back and that you are ready to get into rondo. So let's get into this piece. I'm going to annotate this version, and of course I'll make this available after I'm done with it. We're going to start in A flat major. That's our tonic key. And sort of like compound ternary, you can assume that A is the first section. I'm going to make this bigger just to really emphasize that this is A. Maybe not quite that big. I think I did 40 last time. 45 seems good. So then, having listened to it, you have to decide, does this A section have a nested binary form inside of it? Now, you might also recognize this piece from when we were looking at periods and sentences, because I often use this particular movement as an example of a repeated period, because at the beginning, this beautiful lyrical line that we have leads us to a perfect authentic cadence in measure 8. And then we have the same lyrical melody transposed up an octave, but without any other big significant changes, and repeated. So you can sort of trace that happening here. Da 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 da. I'm sure that's not A flat, but I don't have perfect pitch, so too bad. So here's our PAC in 1 to end this section, and I'm gonna make this a little smaller so that it will fit better. So no nested form here, just a period inside. I'm not going to analyze the parts of the period because you already have another document where I've done that. Okay, so then A has closed with a pack. That means we're into B, what you might even call big B, because it is not the B form of a binary form, it is B overall for the Rondo form that's happening. And you might notice that there's a lot of accidentals, and if you listen to it, you could probably tell that there is a modulation happening. And I'll play just a little bit of the right hand starting here to sort of emphasize that. And so right there, you can probably tell, that was probably a little quiet, sorry, I apologize about that. You can probably tell that there was a cadence right where I stopped. So this looks like 5 going to 1 in the key of, if this is 5 going to 1, then that would make this the key of E flat, which is Roman numeral 5 relative to where we started. So I'll make this a little smaller and make it fit better. That means that that is the end of B. So if I were to kind of draw some of these starting and stopping points, there's the end of A, there's where B begins, here's where B ends, which means that if we have another section, this is not the A section, right? We're expecting the A section to come back, but it hasn't happened yet, which means B is ending, A hasn't returned yet, which means that this is a retransition. And one thing you can do when you're getting acquainted with rondo form is to just listen to it and just note where material repeats, because you'll find those A sections really quickly if you do that. You'll have it memorized well enough that you can recognize it really quickly. So anyway, there's our retransition. And then again, where does A come back? If you're listening to it, I'm sure it's quite clear that that melody comes back right here. So there's the end of our retransition. I'll just draw these clumsy brackets each time that happens. So that would make this A2. So to be specific, I called this A, but I should actually call it A1. There's B, a retransition. This A2 isn't quite big enough, so I'm just going to make it a little bigger. And then we're back to that original period that we had. And notice that this time we get that same phrase. It's coming back and we get most of it again. And then in the A1 section, that repeated up an octave here. I'll just note that here. It's just repeated up an octave. And let's just make that smaller, make it fit better. It's just that same phrase. In A2, we don't need that repetition every single time it happens. It's like gonna start to kind of wear on you. So period does not repeat in A2. Just to sort of note that that's what's happening. That at 35 or 36 here, we get our pack in 1 to close out this section in the correct key. And nope, that. There's the end of A2, which means that this is something different. It is section C. I try to avoid using the term C section a whole bunch of times because I don't want to invoke the wrong image for you. That is section C. You might also have noticed that in the B section we did not have a binary form nested inside there either. Sometimes you might see where it's nested inside A and not one in B or something like that. But this one doesn't really have those nested forms the way that some Rondo forms do. So here's section C. Notice that we have immediately changed keys, and I'll play just the beginning of it for a second. So notice that we have flip-flopped keys. We were in A flat major. We have flip-flopped to the parallel minor, which is actually a really common thing to have happen in the section C, in section C within a rondo form, that this section will be in the parallel minor. So we flip-flop to A flat minor. And then through a kind of strange common chord modulation, we end up, I'm going to start at 40 or 41 and just play the right hand for you with this melody. And then we get that same melody. So we actually have a really important moment here, and it is this 5-1 in the key of E major, which is essentially 5, but it's also what? It's also natural 5. I don't know that I can easily insert a natural, so I'll just say natural 5 like that. Because that is highly unusual, but that's a perfect authentic cadence to end the key. So, or to end the section, which means that even though this is the same melody, we're actually going to not consider it part of C because C was in this other key. And now we're going to say that we're moving already here from C back to the A section for the next A section. So there's our retransition, and you'll recognize where A comes back. It has just this subtle, kind of different pattern in the accompaniment. And so we'll put that label right here to show we're back to A, and I like to make it nice and big, so if you're just glancing through the pages you can see that really clearly. That makes this A3. Here's our period, come back again. And etc. And then notice that the repeat of that period actually does happen this time in this A3 section. So it's a way of reinforcing that because this is going to be the last statement that we get of this A material as is. So right here, I'll start just sort of faking it right from this bar right here. And we'll talk about what happens after that, but importantly, of course, at this moment, there is a perfect authentic cadence in the home key, the original key. So we're back in the key that we're supposed to be in. And that's a big value, right, for the people who are writing this kind of music, that for the piece to be balanced and properly formed, well formed, you might even say, then it needs to end sort of symmetrically with some kind of restatement in the correct key, the original key. So if you've modulated, we modulate because it would be boring if we didn't, but we have to come back. So what we get then again toward the end is simply a little coda. And then it just repeats that little gesture. And so we'll call this the coda, starting right here. I'll try to make that nice and big as well. So there's our coda. And then we get just this very sweet little gesture. So make sure you've listened to that all the way through by the time you have added all of these analytical labels. Maybe go back and listen to it again now that you have some of those labels down, and I think that'll really help you see the rondo as this full picture. So then I have this chart that I am putting together. So for this particular rondo, we can say that we know that there was an A section, and then after the A section, there was no transition, it went directly to B. After the B section, there was a retransition, not trains. After the retransition, we went directly to section C. And then there was another retransition, followed by, wait, I'm skipping things. A, followed by C. So A1, B, retransition, A2, C, retransition, A3, and then a coda. There were no nested forms in any of the sections. So there were no nested binary forms in A1 or B or A2 or C or A3. We can go through and note then, being very specific about where each of these sections starts and stops. And in this edition, this is from the, I think the Schenker edition of these Beethoven sonatas. This is actually, as you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The measure number comes at the end of the bar, which can be kind of strange. So anyway, A1 starts in measure 1 and leads us into measure 16. It's a 16 bar section. Then we start with B, which you could say starts maybe in 17. Really the pick up to 17, but that's okay. B continues until 25, 4, 3, 23, where we have the cadence. Let's also do the keys for these as we're going. We start with 1. The B section, what I think I would say the B section importantly cadences in 5. So I would say maybe it's a little ambiguous at first and then gets to 5, cadences in 5. Because it starts to sound like it's in F minor for a time and then it modulates. F minor would be, you might be thinking, the key of 6. And then eventually gets to 5. You could also use an arrow to show that it's kind of making its way there. Retransitions, we often don't have a really specific thing we say about the key that's happening there because you might be able to say well, it's trying to get from 5 to 1. that's what it's doing, is modulating from there. And the retransition starts in 23, overlapping, that's all right, and ends in 30, 29, 28, right? No nested forms. And then in A2, we start in 29, and we end in, let's see, 35, 36. Then, for the keys, in A2, we're just in 1. Like, we could add that for each of the A sections and for the coda, because we don't modulate during those places. In section C, we begin that in 35, 36, 37. And it lasts until downbeat of 45. And importantly, we're going to say that it starts in the key of minor 1, and it ends up in the key of, I know you can do an insert for this, but I'm just not going to, natural 5, E major. I know you can insert that symbol, I'm just not going to bother. Okay. At that point, we have a retransition again, starting in 45. This kind of mapping can just be a really nice, thorough way to give you a kind of bird's eye picture of the piece and make you really think about where each of those sections happens. Like, this piece is relatively straightforward, but they aren't always. So it's a way of kind of just making your analysis visible in a different way. Okay, so the retransition continues until 50. And its job is to get us from natural 5 to back to 1, which it does. And then we stay in 1 after that. Oh, and A3 begins in 51. And continues until 65, downbeat of 66 even, so let's say that. We said there was a repeated period there. And we said there was a repeated period there. And we could just say no repetition in A2. And then in the coda, we can say that starts in 66 and goes until the end. And that's fine. The end, just to be totally explicit, is 71, 2, 3, 71, 73. And that gives you a kind of complete mapping of the piece. It can be helpful. I wanted to show you again with this piece that's relatively kind of regular, and then we'll see a more kind of elaborate example in a moment. Okay, now let's look at another Beethoven example. This one is basically a standalone rondo, so we're not going to try to fit it in with other movements, but we did look at this opening as an example of a period, I believe, or a binary form. So within this rondo, we're going to see a little bit more kind of zaniness and variety than we did in the last one. So here I've got the score for it up, the blank score, and I hope that before you watch the rest of my video that you'll listen to it and go ahead and start marking it up. I bet you can find at least all the returns of the A section in this piece, if not maybe some other things that are going on. It doesn't fit the mold quite as neatly as the last one did, but it's also a really just wild and I think fun piece. So I'll start by doing some of the markings that we were talking about last time. So here's A1, and you might remember this. And then it repeats that And so that leads us to the end of this initial phrase. We get a pack in 1, but is this the end of the A section entirely? I kind of don't think so, because if you look at what happens next, and it comes back again. So here's another statement of that material. And then notice that it sounds a lot like bars like 5 through 8 or 9. We get this repetition. So there's the end of a binary form. Here's this pack, still in 1, and we could even maybe put it over here. Oh, that's gonna look terrible. Okay, so there's the end of this initial section, which means that actually within A here, we have little a, like little Sebastian. And then over here, that means that we have a digression, followed by the return of little a, can't quite say it, prime. And all of that together makes up A1. So A1 is going to be fairly long before anything has even happened yet. Now here's another thing, that there's a reason that we went sonata and then rondo and then sonata rondo, is that these forms have a lot in common and sometimes similar kind of sections, but not just that the sections are alike, it's more that, not that just their breakdown is alike, it's more that their sections kind of morph in similar ways, or almost like if you think of the section as a function, that what we have here is a transition that also kind of becomes the B section. And that's something that can happen in a sonata as well, or in a sonata rondo, where B and the transition are kind of blended together, molded together, and you never really get a clear beginning of B per se. We do also modulate during that time. So maybe we've modulated to 5 by this point. This is actually a pack in 5 right here, because we've got, look at this movement from A to D there. That kind of root motion by 5th might be a clue. So if you wanted to try to separate B in the transition, maybe you can say that this is the beginning of B, maybe. But I think blending them shows really how seamless that movement is. So it's not really a clear movement away from what has happened and into B in a concrete way, discrete way. And then B takes a really long time to kind of do its thing. And then if you'll notice here, at 35, we get something new. We have this, what essentially feels like standing on the dominant at this point. So starting at 35, we have a retransition that lasts kind of a while. Part of that is because if you'll notice the root motion before that, we actually have a pack leading into that moment. So let me play from this where it says decrescendo slowly. So there we get a pack again in the key of 5, sticking with 5. and that pack cleans up kind of the ending of the B section. So here's our retransition along what you would almost call standing on the dominant, even though that's something that comes from sonata. Again, remember these things kind of blend together, these forms. So that takes us all the way to where it sounds like it's just an enormous half cadence, right? Because then look at what happens here at the end of 43. Etc. So here's A2 after all that, finally. Let me make her bigger. I didn't make the transition in B very big. Let me make it at least a little bit bigger, so it's just sort of easier to see. Like if I were to zoom out, you could see those section breakdowns really clearly. So within B, was there a nested form? I would say no. There isn't a regular sense of like a period or a sentence happening inside there. And then we get a retransition taking us to A2. So if I were to draw that line, again, showing the end of the retransition, it's a very good bracket, as you can see. There's A2, and then within that, do we get a full restatement of A with the nested forms this time? I would say no. For one thing, you can see that this is coming. That's something new, something else. So no nested forms in A2. Again, that's pretty typical. Or at least we might just get little a. We might not get, we wouldn't say that there's like no nested form, but there's just little a right there, without a digression and without little a prime. Here's the cadence that can end A2 for us cleanly. So here's the pack in 1 that ends the A2 section cleanly. And then here we're on to something else. And of course this would be C. So this is big C. I gotta try to really make it big to show you that it's big C, to make it clear that it's not little c. And notice that, like in the other piece we looked at, little c here is in the parallel minor all of a sudden. And a lot of times it's that kind of abrupt modulation to the parallel minor. That is typical. This one has a little bit of a Sturm und Drang kind of feel to it. And then notice that, so we hang out kind of in C minor for a while, and this to me looks like a half cadence in C minor. It doesn't need to be quite so big, now that it's not a section label. Shrink it a bit. Okay. So we get these big kind of like, and then that's the big kind of motive of section C, and that continues. And then notice that we're actually going to modulate a little bit into the key of, in measures like 59 and 60. So notice that there is a modulation there. And then is that a retransition? Are we just going to head back to A at this point? But no, if you look at 67, 68, here's another statement of that C minor stuff. So let's go back up and realize there's a nested form happening within section C. So here's little c. Sometimes I will also then circle those or something to show that they're different, that that's a binary form label happening inside of this. So we've had all of that. Here we have a cadence. We talked about it. I didn't note it. Pack in the key of E flat relative to the home key of C major. So flat 3, right there, E flat. And then that means that we're, as I said, we're starting something new, but it's just a digression. It's not a new section of the rondo. Okay, after all of that happens, Here's where I just said little c prime happens, little c comes back, right about there. Again, I will circle it to make it a little more visible for you and to make it more distinct. Here, I'll circle this digression as well, maybe. That's the only problem with C as a label, is that like little c and big C don't look that different. So there's the binary form happening within all of that. We're looking for a clear cadence in C minor that can serve as the end of that section. And we might get more than one. But look at what we've got going on in the left hand. I want to always be drawing your attention to what's happening in the bass to show you where cadences happen in our demarcating sections. So starting here at 72. So though there is also a cadence, I think, a couple bars before that, this is just another one, the last one, reinforcing it in C minor, which is little 1. Right here, which means that there's our ending of section C. And this kind of chromatic line happening immediately after that, you might have been able to tell listening to it, is the retransition, taking us back to a final time. So here's something. This transition is really funny. I think it's meant to be, this piece I think is meant to be kind of humorous, so let me play some of this. What's the problem? That sounds like the main theme. Problem is in quotation marks, is that this is in the wrong key. So I'll say sounds like A, but wrong key. What? That kind of move. Keep in mind that this music was meant to be performed in like a small living room, like a salon kind of a performance. And so the people listening to it would have heard a ton of pieces like it and know what to expect. And so here's, the person playing it being kind of funny, making a face at you perhaps over here, and then eventually leading back here to say like, oh, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm getting back to the main theme, except that probably some people listening to it would know this is the wrong key. And then I think this next figure would also kind of clue people in. It does repeat most of the A section though, so we're still not getting back to A. We're still in the longest retransition to retransition. If I start right around here, notice how we are hanging out, you might even say standing, on this G major business and then alternating back and forth between that and C minor. So I think that this is also standing on the dominant, preparing us to end this very, very long and dramatic transition. And look, the pianist is not done showing off yet. It's just this big kind of show-offy moment. And I'll spare you from me trying to play this cadenza, but anyway, a ginormous cadenza after having been standing on the dominant all that time. And finally, here, doesn't it feel like a sigh of relief by the time you get there? It's so satisfying because he's been messing with you. Okay, so let me turn this up. Make that bigger. And then we can look and see, does all of it come back or is it just little a again? And we'll go ahead and add little a, but I'll make it more lil. And I'll also circle it just to sort of draw your attention that this is different. Again, like I did before. So here is the almost regular, almost unchanged version of the A section. triplets and some more chromatic embellishments and some more tuplets added to give this some more pizzazz. Do you recognize this music that comes in 100? If you look back to page 1, you might recognize that this is actually the digression. Again, lil digression. Happening inside of A, the binary form that is happening, a lil binary. And then after that finally happens, do we get back all the way to A? Yes, but it looks like there's some more business coming. So let's note that here is lil A. Oops. Nope. Here's lil A prime. And I'll circle it. And of course we can't just simply close after having a piece with this many cadenzas already in dramatic flourishes, so instead we don't end little a normally. And then we get that phrase a couple of times, and then this Sturm und Drang stuff kind of comes back. So what we're seeing here is not just little a, it's little a mixed with the coda. And these things are happening kind of together. Let me move little a little bit to make room for that label. Yeah, we have the coda popping up here, kind of blended with what would just be a little a section, but instead we're going to get some more drama. And then at 117 it starts to feel like, okay, it's more of a guarantee. We're going to end this in the correct key, etc. And we kind of trade the da 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 in each of these hands, and then it wouldn't be complete without another very dramatic cadenza motion, and then it goes out a little bit more subdued. So it takes us a while, but we do eventually get all the way done with this piece. And there's just a couple cadences to note here that this really does close in a traditional way, back with a pack in one there, and a pack in one over here. So I'm glad we got to come back to this piece, and I hope that you'll go back and listen to it now that we've talked about it in this detail. But we're not done yet, because I do want to go through section by section and map it out on this chart the way we did before. So we know that it had the following sections. We know it had a A1 section. We know that there was a transition that was kind of with B together. Or here I can make that an arrow together. There was a retransition after B, leading back to A2. There was a section that we'll call C, and a long retransition from C, if you remember. And then an A3 section, followed by, that included, although we'll put it over here, a little a prime becoming the coda. Again, I want that to be lil. So, within A1, was there a nested form? Yes, there was nested binary of A, digression, little a prime. The thing to note was, what kind of binary form was it then? If we go all the way back up. The end of the first part of the binary form ended with a pack in one. So you might be asking yourself, does that make it sectional or continuous? If little a ends with a pack in one, that makes it sectional. And then was it rounded or balanced or simple? We got a prime back at the end. I would call that balanced. Balanced. Okay, so then that is all nested inside A1. B, if we go back and look at B, notice that we said that there was not a nested form in B and not in the retransition. And then in A2, we only got little a, not full binary form. In C, you'll recall that C minor thing that was like bum bum da 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 bum bum da 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 da. You're welcome for my sung performance of it. Yes, there was a nested binary form of C, digression, and little c prime. The question is, what kind is it? So you have to go back to the end of the little c section, which was in bar 59, and notice that had not the correct key in it. So for example, little c started in C minor, and by the end of that section, it had actually moved to E flat major, which is that flat 3. And then it ended up back in 1. But in any case, that means that that has to be continuous because the little c did not end with a pack in its home key. Then was it rounded or balanced? I think we could say rounded, with the knowledge that it probably had to have a few small changes to make it fit the kind of different ending, because it's not going to be a pack in the wrong key at the end of it. Then our retransition is not going to have one of those. We got a full return of A1's binary form, so that was definitely there. A, digression, and little a prime. And then in little a prime leads directly to the coda that has no nested forms. It just sort of steals a prime and turns it into a coda. So, looking at the measures, I don't think you need to have a different measure number for each of those things, but we could say that it goes from 1 to 18 or so. Transition in B moves from 18 to about 35. If I were to grade you on something like this, I would simply accept if you were 1 or 2 measures off in each case, because I feel like just the nature of having a piece with a ton of measures and different editors numbering them slightly differently or putting the number in different places can make it confusing. So anyway, B did change keys from starting in the tonic to, we said that it moved to D major, which is actually 2. And then by the end of B, we had a pack in G major, which is 5. So that's what our keys look like for that. And then of course the job of the retransition is to move from 5 back to 1. And the retransition expands from 35 to 44. Our A2 went from 44 to 52 and stayed in the home key like it was supposed to. Section C started in 52 and lasted until 73, when its retransition sort of starts. Oops, we already did its keys. This retransition starts in the little tonic, and you might recall it had that fake return in the key of A flat, which would be flat 6, and then finally made its way back to a big 5, or 5 of the home key on the standing on the dominant that seemed to go on forever and ever. So then we finally had A3. In A3 we said, or excuse me, I'll note the measure there that's missing. This retransition is very long and it lasts until 92. At 92, A came back And that time, all of it comes back, but except when a prime happens, I'm just going to note those measures differently because that's also the beginning of the coda. So the coda goes to 136, which is also the end. Of course, that stayed in the home key like it was supposed to, and so did A3. So I just find that as a useful way to kind of like summarize the whole piece in a different visual format. I tend to be a bit of a visual thinker, so I like having it all kind of mapped out in front of me like this. So if you have any questions about this piece or about this analysis, rondo form in general, or a particular harmonic kind of moment in the piece that you want to talk about, same goes for the C minor movement or the Opus 13 movement, definitely let me know. You can email me, we can talk about it one-on-one, or you can post in the discussion about it. I'd be happy to, see if you wanted to get some comments from your classmates there too. And I'll be back with Sonata Rondo form. Bye for now.